The penthouse office sat 47 stories above the city glass walls, framing a view most men would kill for. Declan Rivers stood 3 feet from a desk worth more than his annual salary, staring at a gun that might as well have been pointed at his daughter's head. The Beretta rested on polished mahogany between him and Preston Hartwell, 71 years old, silver-haired, confined to a wheelchair that probably cost more than Declan's car, wearing a smile that belonged on a grandfather handing out candy at Christmas. Ruby sat 20 feet away in the adjoining conference room, visible through floor-to-ceiling glass coloring in a Disney princess book with crayons someone had thoughtfully provided. She hummed while she worked, oblivious to the fact that her father was negotiating for her life. Preston's voice carried the warmth of aged bourbon and old money. "Choose Mr. Rivers. $10 million for Ruby's future, or revenge that destroys you both." Declan's hand moved toward the gun. Earlier that night, the eviction notice had been taped to the door for 3 days before Declan finally pulled it down. Red ink on white paper, official letterhead from the property management company. The kind of finality that no amount of pleading would reverse. He had $28,347 in his checking account, which meant he was exactly $217 short of making rent. Again, Ruby stood in the kitchen of their rented duplex, holding a box of generic macaroni and cheese, the kind that came in bulk packages from the discount grocery store where everything was slightly past its sell-by date but still technically edible. She was 7 years old, red-haired like her mother had been, with eyes that saw too much and asked questions adults spent lifetimes avoiding. "Daddy, why don't we ever have the good kind anymore?" The good kind meant name brand. The blue box with the cartoon character, the one that cost 60 cents more and might as well have been caviar given their current financial situation. Declan looked at his daughter and felt something crack in his chest, the same fracture that had been spreading since Caroline died, since the world decided grief was a luxury you couldn't afford when you had a child to feed. "The store was out, sweetheart. This one tastes just as good." Ruby's eyes said she knew he was lying, but she also knew better than to push. She'd learned that somewhere between her mother's funeral and the day Declan stopped being an engineer and started being a municipal building inspector, a job that paid $41,000 a year and came with the kind of soul-crushing boredom that made you understand why some men drank themselves to death. He used to make $98,000, used to wear suits that required dry cleaning, used to look at blueprints for skyscrapers and shopping centers and housing developments, calculating load-bearing capacities and soil compaction ratios, finding problems before they became body counts. Then Highland Residences collapsed. Caroline had been inside visiting a friend on the 3rd floor when the entire structure pancaked. 14 people died because someone decided profit margins mattered more than human lives. The official report blamed foundation failure. Declan knew better. He'd reviewed the plans for that building 4 years ago when he still worked for Hartwell Construction, had flagged the issues in his report, had been called into Preston Hartwell's office, the billionaire already confined to a wheelchair from a construction accident years prior, and offered $75,000 cash to revise his findings. He'd said no. He'd also not reported the bribery attempt to anyone, just quietly submitted his resignation and pretended that walking away was the same thing as doing the right thing. 3 weeks later, Highland Residences opened for occupancy. 18 months after that, it fell down, and Declan's wife was crushed under 40,000 tons of concrete and steel and his own cowardice. The settlement offer from Hartwell Construction had arrived 6 weeks after the funeral. $2.5 million contingent on signing a non-disclosure agreement and waiving all future legal claims. Declan read it once, tore it into pieces, and spent the next 6 months applying for engineering jobs at every firm in a 200-mile radius. None of them returned his calls. Preston Hartwell's influence reached further than gravity, and blacklisting didn't require written evidence when everyone in the industry understood how the game was played. So Declan became an inspector, $41,000 a year, a clipboard, and the authority to shut down projects if they violated code. It was penance disguised as employment, and he wore it like a hair shirt, checking the same calculations he used to create, looking for the same shortcuts he used to ignore. Ruby poured the macaroni into boiling water, stirring with the competence of a child who'd been making her own meals since she was 6. She didn't complain about the generic brand or the fact that dinner was the same thing they'd eaten 3 nights running. She just cooked, and Declan stood in the doorway watching her, thinking about how Caroline would have known what to say, would have found a way to make poverty feel like an adventure instead of a slow drowning. His phone buzzed. Owen Kemp, his supervisor at the municipal inspection office, had been texting him for 3 days straight about something that wasn't work-related, which meant it was probably terrible. "You still breathing? Rivers need to talk to you. Important." Declan typed back one-handed while pulling plates from the cabinet mismatched thrift store ceramic that had replaced the wedding china they'd sold during month 2 of unemployment. "Working. Can it wait? No. Meet me at Rosewood Cafe tomorrow, 3 p.m. Don't make me hunt you down." Owen was 52, divorced twice, and possessed the kind of aggressive optimism that came from never having experienced real tragedy. He thought problems were puzzles, and puzzles had solutions, and he'd been trying to fix Declan's life since the day they met, oblivious to the fact that some things stayed broken no matter how much duct tape and good intentions you applied. Declan ignored the message and focused on dinner, which Ruby had already finished preparing, while he stood there being useless. They ate in silence, the television playing some cartoon. Neither of them was watching, and when Ruby asked if they could afford ice cream for dessert, Declan lied again and said they were out, even though the real answer was that $3 for a pint meant $3 he couldn't spend on the electricity bill that was already 2 weeks overdue. His phone buzzed again. Owen, relentless as cancer. "It's about a woman. Before you delete this, hear me out." Declan deleted it. 3 seconds later, another message. "I set you up on a blind date. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Rosewood Cafe. You're going." The air left Declan's lungs in a rush that felt like being punched. Owen had been threatening this for months, insisting that 4 years was long enough to grieve, that Ruby needed a mother figure, that Declan was wasting his life marinating in guilt. He'd deflected every attempt with the skill of a man who'd spent 4 years avoiding anything that felt like moving forward. This time Owen had gone around him completely. Declan called. Owen answered before the first ring finished, which meant he'd been waiting for the explosion. "Before you start yelling, she's perfect for you. Same situation, knows what loss feels like. Smart as hell. And she specifically said she wanted to meet someone who wouldn't run away the second things got complicated. I didn't agree to this. You don't get to live like a hermit forever, Rivers. Ruby deserves better than watching you turn into a ghost." The words hit harder than intended, maybe because they were true, maybe because Declan had been thinking the exact same thing while watching his daughter make dinner alone. He looked at Ruby now, bent over a math worksheet, chewing on a pencil, with the same expression Caroline used to wear when she was concentrating, and something in him gave way like a load-bearing wall, finally admitting it couldn't hold the weight anymore. 1 hour. That's all I'm asking. Her name's Jo. She's a journalist. And Rivers, don't Google her before you meet. Just show up and be human for 60 minutes. The call ended before Declan could change his mind. He sat there staring at his phone, wondering if this was what dying felt like, the slow acceptance that you couldn't stop the inevitable, so you might as well let it happen. Ruby glanced up from her homework. "Who was that, Owen? He wants to meet for coffee tomorrow." "About what?" The question was innocent, but Ruby had a way of asking innocent questions that required dishonest answers, and Declan had promised himself after Caroline died that he wouldn't lie to his daughter any more than absolutely necessary. "He set me up on a date." Ruby's eyes went wide, the pencil freezing mid-chew. "With a lady. That's generally how dates work. Are you going to go?" Declan wanted to say no, wanted to explain that dating meant opening yourself up to losing someone again, meant trusting that the universe wouldn't take this person away. 2 meant believing in futures that had a habit of collapsing without warning. Instead, he looked at his daughter and saw hope in her face. The kind of hope that had no business existing in a child who'd watched her mother die and her father dissolve into a walking collection of regrets. "Yeah, I think I am." Ruby smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. "Good. You need friends." Friends. The word sat in Declan's chest like a stone, heavy and uncomfortable, because he knew Owen wasn't setting him up with a friend, and Ruby knew it too. But calling it friendship made it safer somehow, made it something that couldn't hurt you as much when it ended. Rosewood Cafe sat on a corner downtown, the kind of place that charged $7 for coffee and made you feel sophisticated for overpaying. Declan arrived at 2:57, 3 minutes early, because being late to something this terrifying felt like admitting defeat before the battle started. He sat in his car across the street, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching people come and go through the front door. At 2:59, a navy blue van pulled into the handicapped space out front. Declan watched as the side door opened and a ramp extended automatically. Watched as a woman emerged, not in a wheelchair, but standing with crutches, her left leg dragging slightly as she made her way down the ramp and onto the sidewalk with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. She wore jeans and a green sweater, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, and from this distance, she looked like someone who had her life together in all the ways Declan didn't. The crutch registered in his brain like a punch to the gut, not because of the aid itself, but because of what it meant. This woman had already survived something terrible, was already damaged in visible ways that would make people stare and ask questions and treat her like she was made of glass. Dating her would mean navigating a world of complications. Declan wasn't sure he had the energy for, would mean accepting another person's trauma on top of his own, would mean opening himself up to caring about someone whose life could end or change or disappear at any moment for reasons beyond anyone's control. Every instinct he had screamed at him to start the car and drive away, to send Owen a text apologizing for wasting everyone's time, to go home and return to the safe cocoon of isolation where nothing hurt because nothing mattered. He sat there for 47 seconds, counting them off in his head like a countdown to detonation. Then the woman looked through the cafe window directly at where his car was parked, and their eyes met. And Declan realized with absolute certainty that Owen had shown her a picture, had told her what kind of car to look for, had set this up so thoroughly that backing out now would make him the kind of coward he'd spent 4 years trying not to be. She waved, not a big theatrical gesture, just a small acknowledgement that she saw him and knew he was terrified and was giving him an out if he wanted to take it. Declan got out of the car. The walk across the street felt like crossing a battlefield, every step requiring conscious effort, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that suggested his body understood this was dangerous even if his brain was pretending otherwise. He reached the door of the cafe and stopped, one hand on the handle, looking through the glass at this woman who was waiting for him to either come inside or run away. She maneuvered closer to the window on her crutches and mouthed 2 words. "It's okay." The door opened and cold air rushed past him into the warmth of the cafe, carrying with it the smell of coffee and cinnamon and all the normal things people did when their lives weren't held together with duct tape and denial. Declan stepped inside, and the door closed behind him with a finality that felt like sealing a tomb or opening one, he couldn't tell which. The woman extended her hand before he could say anything, her grip firm and warm when he shook it. "You're Declan, and you're staring at my crutch." The bluntness caught him off guard, bypassing all the polite small talk he'd been rehearsing in his head during the walk over. "I'm sorry I didn't—" "Owen didn't tell you. Most people don't mention it up front. It's okay to be surprised." Declan pulled out the chair across from her and sat, his hands already shaking slightly, which was ridiculous because he'd faced down construction foremen twice his size over code violations and never flinched. This was different. This mattered. "I'm Jo. Josephine Whitman, but nobody calls me that except my mother when she's mad. Car accident 3 years ago. Drunk driver ran a red light. My friend who was driving walked away with bruises. I didn't. And before you say you're sorry, don't. I'm not looking for pity. I'm looking for coffee and conversation with someone who doesn't treat me like I'm made of glass." The words came out practiced, like a speech she'd given dozens of times, but there was something underneath them, a weariness that Declan recognized from his own reflection. She'd been doing this a while, this explaining herself to strangers, this managing other people's discomfort with her existence. A waitress appeared beside their table, young and efficient, taking their orders without the hovering awkwardness that some people brought to serving someone with mobility challenges. Jo ordered a vanilla latte. Declan asked for black coffee, no sugar, because adding sweetness to anything in his life felt dishonest. After the waitress left, Joe leaned back slightly, studying him with eyes that were too perceptive for comfort. "Owen said you lost your wife. I'm sorry." The condolence landed like they always did, well-meaning and useless, but Declan had learned to accept them, the way you accept rain, as something that happens whether you want it to or not. 4 years ago, building collapsed. She was visiting a friend on the 3rd floor. The whole structure came down. Joe's expression shifted, something flickering across her face too fast to identify, but her voice stayed level when she spoke. "Highland Residences." It wasn't a question. Declan's spine straightened, adrenaline spiking, because there was no reason for her to know that, no reason for a journalist he'd never met to connect his dead wife to a specific building, unless she'd been looking, unless this wasn't a blind date at all, but something else entirely. "How do you know that I'm an investigative journalist? Or I was before the accident. Now I'm more of a freelancer. I covered the Highland collapse when it happened. 14 victims, families given settlements, official report blamed foundation failure." She paused, her eyes never leaving his. "You didn't take the settlement?" "No." "Why not?" The question was simple, but the answer required admitting things Declan had spent 4 years not admitting, required explaining that taking money would have meant accepting that Caroline's death was just an accident, just bad luck, just one of those things that happen when you build structures tall enough to touch the sky. It would have meant letting Preston Hartwell walk away clean, would have meant being complicit in the lie that killed her, because it was blood money. Joe nodded slowly, like he'd just confirmed something she already knew. "You blamed Hartwell Construction. I know Hartwell Construction was responsible. That's a strong accusation. It's a fact. I used to work for them. I reviewed the plans for that building. I flagged the issues in my report. They offered me money to revise my findings. I refused." The confession spilled out before Declan could stop it, 4 years of silence breaking like a dam someone had finally put too much pressure on. Joe's eyes widened slightly, the first real reaction she'd shown since he sat down. "You were the engineer who walked away. You've done your homework." "I always do." She pulled her phone from her purse, swiped through something, then turned the screen toward him. The display showed a list of addresses and project names organized by date, each one tagged with notes in red text. "This is a list of every building Hartwell Construction has completed in the last 20 years. 17 of them have documented structural issues. 3 have been condemned. Highland Residences was the only one where people died, but it wasn't the first time corners were cut." Declan looked at the list, recognizing project names from his time at the firm, seeing addresses that made his stomach turn because he'd worked on some of these, had signed off on designs that he knew weren't quite right, but had told himself were close enough. Had been the kind of engineer who convinced himself that following orders was the same thing as doing his job. "Why are you showing me this?" Joe pulled the phone back, her expression unreadable. "Because Owen didn't set us up on a blind date. I asked him to introduce us." The air in the cafe suddenly felt too thin, like the oxygen had been replaced with something heavier that his lungs couldn't process. Declan's hands curled into fists under the table, rage and betrayal, and something close to relief, all hitting simultaneously, because at least now he knew at least the uncertainty was over, and he could go back to his safe bubble of isolation where people didn't manipulate him into meetings under false pretenses. So this was what research and interview. "At first," Joe's voice softened, losing the journalistic edge. "But then I read about you, about Caroline, about how you refused the settlement and got blacklisted from every engineering firm in 3 states, about how you're raising your daughter alone on an inspector salary, living in a rental you can barely afford, and still showing up every day to do the job nobody else wants. And I thought maybe you'd want to know the truth." "What truth?" "That your wife didn't die in an accident. She was murdered." The word hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun, impossible to unsee once you'd registered it was there. Declan's throat closed up, his vision narrowing to a tunnel that had Joe's face at the end of it, and somewhere in the back of his mind, the part that was still capable of rational thought. He understood that this moment was the edge of something that, whatever came next, would determine whether he spent the rest of his life drowning or finally learned to swim. The waitress returned with their drinks, setting them down with a smile that Declan couldn't return, and then she was gone, and it was just him and Joe and the truth that had been waiting 4 years to be spoken out loud. Highland residences collapsed because Hartwell Construction used substandard materials and falsified inspection reports. The concrete was mixed with 30% more sand than code allows. The rebar was grade 40 instead of grade 60. The soil-bearing capacity was documented at 1,400 pounds per square foot when the actual load required 2,800 minimum. Every single one of those decisions was made consciously, deliberately, to save $4.7 million in construction costs. Jo pulled out a tablet from the bag attached to her crutch, pulled up documents that looked like internal emails and engineering reports and accounting spreadsheets. Declan's hands shook as he scrolled through them, seeing words like optimization and cost reduction and acceptable risk, seeing his own calculations from 4 years ago next to revised versions that had his name forged at the bottom. Preston Hartwell approved every shortcut. 14 people died so he could increase his profit margin by 18%. Declan's coffee went cold while he read his brain processing information his heart had known for 4 years, seeing the proof laid out in black and white, and feeling something inside him shift from grief into fury, from acceptance into rage. So pure it felt like gasoline poured directly into his bloodstream. "Where did you get this?" A whistleblower in Hartwell's accounting department. Anonymous, untraceable. Sent everything to me 6 months ago. I tried to publish. My editor killed the story. Said we couldn't prove intent. Said Hartwell's lawyers would bury us in litigation. Said I was letting personal bias cloud my judgment. Personal bias. Jo's jaw tightened. My car accident 3 years ago wasn't an accident. 2 days before it happened, I got an email telling me to stop investigating Hartwell or I'd regret it. I ignored it. The drunk driver who hit me was a construction foreman Hartwell fired 3 weeks earlier. He had $50,000 cash in his apartment. No job, no family, no reason to have that kind of money, except someone paid him to shut me up. He committed suicide before the trial, so we'll never know for sure. But I know. The pieces fell into place with the sickening clarity of watching a building collapse in slow motion, seeing how every structural failure connected to every other structural failure until the whole thing became inevitable. Hartwell had killed Caroline to protect his profits, had tried to kill Jo for the same reason, had probably killed the foreman to tie up loose ends, and was somewhere right now building more death traps while the bodies piled up and the law looked the other way. Why are you telling me this? Because I need your help. The accounting department whistleblower gave me financial proof, but I need technical proof. I need someone who can read these blueprints and explain in language a jury can understand exactly how Hartwell killed those people. I need an engineer who has nothing to lose and everything to gain by burning that company to the ground. Declan looked at this woman he'd known for 20 minutes, this stranger who'd just handed him the evidence that could destroy the man who destroyed his life, and felt the weight of a decision that had probably already been made the moment he got out of his car and walked into this cafe. I have a daughter. I can't put her at risk. I understand. But Hartwell is building 8 new residential complexes right now. Same materials, same shortcuts, same profit margin calculations. If we don't stop him, 50 more people are going to die, and some of them will have daughters too. The logic was airtight, the moral calculus too clear to argue with, but Declan's hands were still shaking and his coffee was still cold, and somewhere across town, Ruby was getting out of school and expecting him to pick her up and take her home to their duplex, where the electricity might get shut off tomorrow, but at least nobody was trying to kill them. I need time to think. I know. Take all the time you need. But Declan Jo reached across the table and put her hand over his, her skin warm against his cold fingers. Your wife deserved better than foundation failure. She deserved the truth, and you deserve the chance to give it to her. Declan drove home in silence, the tablet Jo had given him sitting on the passenger seat like a bomb waiting to detonate. And when he picked Ruby up from school, she asked him how the date went, and he lied and said it was fine, which was the most dishonest thing he'd said in years, because fine didn't cover meeting someone who just handed you the keys to revenge wrapped in justice. That night after Ruby went to bed, Declan sat at the kitchen table and opened the tablet and read every document Jo had given him. Emails between Preston Hartwell and his construction managers discussing ways to reduce costs without triggering inspector red flags. Accounting spreadsheets showing exactly how much money was saved by using cheaper materials. Engineering reports with Declan's signature forged at the bottom, approving designs he'd explicitly rejected. He read until his eyes burned and the words blurred together, and somewhere around 3 in the morning he came to the document that made him put the tablet down and walk to the bathroom and throw up until his stomach was empty and his throat was raw. It was Caroline's autopsy report. Cause of death: blunt force trauma, crushing injuries consistent with structural collapse. Time of death approximately 4 minutes after initial building failure, which meant she hadn't died instantly, had been alive and conscious, and in unimaginable pain, while the weight of Preston Hartwell's greed pressed the life out of her, while Declan was blocks away in his office reviewing permit applications, while Ruby was at school learning her multiplication tables, while the world kept spinning, and Caroline spent 4 minutes understanding that she was going to die, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Declan washed his face and looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man who'd spent 4 years telling himself that walking away from Hartwell Construction was enough, that not being complicit was the same as being righteous, that protecting himself meant protecting his daughter. He saw a coward who'd let his wife die rather than risk his career, who'd taken an inspector job as penance but never actually done anything to make the penance mean something. Ruby's voice came from the hallway, small and sleepy. "Daddy, why are you crying?" He wiped his eyes and turned to find her standing in the doorway wearing pajamas with dinosaurs on them, Caroline's red hair sticking up at angles that defied physics. She looked so much like her mother that Declan's chest physically hurt, the kind of pain that didn't come from injury, but from absence, from the hole left behind when someone essential gets ripped out of your life. "Just thinking about Mommy." Ruby patted across the bathroom tile and wrapped her arms around his waist, hugging him with the fierce intensity of a 7-year-old who'd already learned that the people you love can disappear without warning. "Mrs. Patterson says when we remember people we should do something they'd be proud of. What would Mommy want you to do?" The question was innocent, asked without agenda or expectation, but it cut through every excuse Declan had been building in his head since leaving the cafe. Caroline had been fearless, had believed in fighting for what was right, even when the odds were impossible, had taught him that integrity wasn't about grand gestures, but about small choices made when nobody was watching. She would have wanted him to tell the truth. She would have wanted him to stop Hartwell before more families got destroyed. She would have wanted him to teach their daughter that some things were worth risking everything for, even if it meant losing the little you had left. Declan knelt down so he was eye level with Ruby, his hands on her shoulders, looking into eyes that were too old for her age but still young enough to believe her father could protect her from anything. "I'm going to do something that might be scary, but it's the right thing. And sometimes doing the right thing is scary. Do you understand?" Ruby nodded slowly. "Like when you took me to get shots even though I didn't want to. Exactly like that." "Okay, I trust you, Daddy." The words settled over Declan like armor, like absolution, like a promise he'd made to himself a long time ago, and then forgotten in the wake of grief and poverty and the slow erosion of believing anything mattered. He kissed Ruby's forehead and sent her back to bed, and then he sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out his phone and sent a text to Joe Whitman before he could change his mind. "I'm in. When do we start?" The response came back in less than 30 seconds. "Tomorrow. I'll come to you. What's your address?" Declan sent it, his heart pounding like he'd just committed to jumping off a cliff without checking if there was water below, and then he put the phone down and sat in the silence of his kitchen and wondered if this was what resurrection felt like, the moment when you decided that staying dead was easier but living was necessary. He didn't sleep that night, just sat at the table reading documents and making notes and thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, all the dangers he was inviting into Ruby's life by choosing to fight instead of hide. But underneath the fear was something else, something he hadn't felt in 4 years. A burning certainty that felt like rage and righteousness, and the first real breath he'd taken since Caroline died. When morning came and sunlight hit the kitchen window, Declan looked at the tablet full of evidence and the coffee cup he'd forgotten to drink, and his daughter's backpack hanging by the door. and he knew with absolute clarity that there was no going back. Now that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that whatever happened next would either destroy him completely or give him back the pieces of himself he'd lost when Highland Residences fell. Jo arrived at 10, her van navigating the cracked sidewalk in front of the duplex with practiced ease. Declan opened the door before she could knock, and when she looked at him, she smiled like she could see the decision written on his face. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't. Come in." She maneuvered through the doorway and stopped when she saw the 3 steps leading up to the main floor, the architectural barrier that most houses had and most people didn't think about until they needed to. Declan watched her calculate the problem, saw the moment she decided it wasn't worth the effort of finding a solution. "I can work from here if you want to bring." Ruby appeared at the top of the stairs, still in her pajamas, staring down at the woman with crutches, with the unfiltered curiosity of a child who hadn't learned yet that staring was rude. "Who's that?" "This is Jo. She's helping me with something." Ruby disappeared without a word, and Declan started to apologize. But then she reappeared, dragging 2 long wooden planks from the garage, the same boards he'd been meaning to build shelves with for 6 months and never gotten around to. She positioned them against the steps with the confidence of someone who'd solved this problem before. "My friend Tommy's grandma uses crutches. He showed me this." Jo's eyes went wide, something shifting in her expression that might have been surprise or gratitude or recognition that this 7-year-old had just demonstrated more empathy in 30 seconds than most adults managed in a lifetime. She tested the makeshift ramp carefully, and Declan held his breath until she reached the top, and Ruby held the door open like she was welcoming royalty. "Thank you, Ruby. You're welcome. Do you want breakfast?" "We have cereal, but not the good kind." Jo laughed genuinely, the sound filling the cramped duplex with something that felt almost like joy. "I already ate, but thank you for offering." Ruby studied her for another moment, then asked with the directness only children possessed, "Does your crutch hurt? Not anymore?" "It did at first, but now it's just part of how I move around." "Okay." Ruby accepted this with a shrug and turned to Declan. "Can I watch cartoons?" "Go ahead, sweetheart." She disappeared into the living room, leaving Declan and Jo alone in the kitchen, where the tablet full of evidence still sat on the table next to his cold coffee and the weight of decisions that would change everything. Jo moved closer, her voice dropping low enough that Ruby wouldn't overhear. "She's wonderful. She's everything. Then we need to be smart about this. Hartwell has already killed people to protect his secrets. We can't give him a reason to think Ruby's a threat. How do we do that? We make sure she never knows what we're doing. As far as Ruby's concerned, I'm just your friend who comes over sometimes. Normal, boring, safe. Can you do that?" Declan looked toward the living room where cartoons were playing too loud, where his daughter sat cross-legged on a couch that came from a thrift store, and believed her father could protect her from anything, because she was 7 and hadn't learned yet that fathers were just men who tried their best and failed anyway. "Yeah, I can do that." They spent the next 4 hours at the kitchen table going through blueprints and engineering reports, Declan explaining in language Jo could translate for readers exactly how every shortcut Hartwell took directly led to Highland Residences collapsing. The rebar calculations, the concrete mixture ratios, the soil compaction standards that got ignored because testing was expensive and bribing inspectors was cheaper. Every document was another nail in Preston Hartwell's coffin, another piece of proof that 14 people didn't die in an accident, but in a murder that happened in slow motion over 18 months of construction. And with each page they reviewed, Declan felt something shifting inside him. The grief that had paralyzed him for 4 years, transforming into rage that had direction and purpose and a target that deserved everything it was about to receive. Around 2 in the afternoon, Jo closed the last file and looked at Declan with eyes that held equal parts admiration and concern. "This is enough. With what you've explained and what I have from the whistleblower, we can prove everything. The question is whether you're ready for what comes next." "What comes next?" "We find the engineer who actually signed off on the falsified reports. We get him to testify. We hand everything to the FBI and let them decide if 18 years of corporate manslaughter is worth prosecuting. You think they'll care? I think Preston Hartwell is about to discover that being rich doesn't make you invincible when the evidence is this clear and the witness list includes the husband of one of his victims? Walter Brennan lived in a ranch house on the edge of town where the suburbs gave way to farmland and the streetlights ended. Declan found the address in the county property records, cross-referenced it with the engineering license database, and confirmed that this was the man whose signature appeared on every falsified Highland Residences report, the man who'd been paid or threatened or broken into approving designs that killed 14 people, including Caroline. Jo sat in the passenger seat of Declan's truck, her crutches folded behind them, reviewing notes on her tablet while Declan drove through neighborhoods that got progressively more isolated until houses appeared only every few hundred yards, separated by fields of corn stubble and wire fences. The sun was setting, painting everything orange and red like the world was on fire. What if he doesn't talk? Jo didn't look up from her screen. Then we find another way. But everyone talks eventually. The question is what they say and whether it's useful. They pulled into Brennan's driveway at 7:45, the house dark, except for a single light in what looked like the kitchen. Declan killed the engine and sat there gathering courage that felt increasingly theoretical, wondering if confronting a stranger about conspiracy to commit mass murder was the kind of thing you could do casually on a Tuesday evening. Jo's hand found his on the steering wheel. "I'll do the talking. You're here as technical verification. If things go bad, we leave." "Agreed. Agreed." The front door opened before they reached the porch. A man in his 60s appeared in the frame, backlit by interior light. Walter Brennan looked like every engineer Declan had ever worked with, glasses and flannel shirt and posture that suggested decades spent hunched over drafting tables. But there was something else in his face, something hollow and haunted that spoke to nights spent not sleeping and days spent carrying weight that bent you into shapes you weren't designed for. "I know why you're here." His voice carried resignation instead of surprise, like he'd been expecting this conversation for 4 years and was almost relieved it was finally happening. He stepped aside without waiting for confirmation, gesturing them into a house that smelled like coffee and failure. The living room was sparse furniture, minimal walls bare except for engineering certificates that hung like accusations instead of achievements. Declan counted 7 different licenses and professional accreditations, each one representing years of study and work that had all led to signing documents that killed people for money. Walter sat in an armchair that faced the window, his back to them, staring out at darkness and cornfields. "You're Caroline Rivers' husband, and you're the journalist who got hurt for asking questions." Jo positioned herself where Walter could see her without turning. "We need you to testify against Preston Hartwell." "I can't." "Yes, you can. We have the emails, the accounting records, the evidence that proves Hartwell ordered you to falsify those reports. You're not the villain here, Walter. You're a victim too. You don't understand what he's capable of." Declan's hands curled into fists at his sides, rage building like pressure in a sealed container. "He killed my wife. I understand exactly what he's capable of." Walter turned, finally his eyes meeting Declan's, and what lived in them was pure terror aged 4 years into something chronic and corrosive. "He killed my dog. Had it skinned and mailed me the collar with a note that said, 'Sign or you're next.' This was before Highland even opened, before anyone died. I reported it to police and they said there was no evidence of foul play. Dogs go missing all the time, probably coyotes. 3 days later my car brakes failed on the highway. Mechanic said the line looked like it had been cut clean through. Another accident, another coincidence." He stood and walked to a desk in the corner, pulled out a folder stuffed with papers and photographs that he thrust toward Jo like evidence in a trial he'd been conducting alone for years. "That's every threat, every near miss, every suspicious incident from the last 4 years. 15 separate events that could have killed me but didn't because Preston Hartwell wanted me alive and scared instead of dead and silent. You want me to testify? Sure, I'll do it. And 3 days later I'll have another accident, except this time it'll work, and you'll have 1 less witness, and I'll be 1 more body in Preston's ledger." Jo flipped through the folder, her face hardening with each page, each photograph of slashed tires and broken windows and threatening letters assembled from magazine cutouts like something out of a movie, except this was real and documented and absolutely terrifying in its systematic persistence. "The FBI can protect you. Witness protection, relocation, new identity." Walter laughed, bitter and broken. You really believe that Preston has senators on payroll? He donates millions to political campaigns. He plays golf with the head of the state police. You think federal protection means anything when the people protecting you are friends with the person you're testifying against? Declan felt his certainty cracking, the righteous fury that had propelled him here colliding with the reality that power wasn't just money, but infrastructure, relationships, systems designed to protect those at the top from accountability, no matter how obvious their guilt. Preston Hartwell wasn't just rich. He was integrated into the machinery of government and law enforcement in ways that made him functionally untouchable. Then what do we do? Walter sank back into his chair, defeated before the fight even started. You walk away. You take your daughter, and you move somewhere Preston doesn't care about, and you live whatever life you can build from the ashes. That's what survival looks like when you're fighting people who own the referees. The words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything they touched, and Declan understood in that moment that this was the real cliff edge, the point where most people turned back because going forward meant accepting that justice was a fairy tale. We told ourselves to pretend civilization was real. Jo closed the folder and set it on the coffee table between them with deliberate care. I'm not walking away, and I don't think you want to either. You've been living in fear for 4 years, Walter. Hasn't it occurred to you that if Preston wanted you dead, you'd be dead? He keeps you alive because you're more useful scared than silent. But the second we publish, the second this goes public with or without your testimony, that calculus changes. Your only safety is in exposure, in making sure everyone knows exactly what you know, so there's no point in killing you after the fact. Unless he kills me before you publish. Then we publish anyway, and you become a martyr instead of a coward. Either way, Preston loses. Walter's face twisted through emotions that looked like grief and rage and exhaustion, all compressed into the same expression. I have a daughter, too. She's 23, lives in Portland, doesn't talk to me anymore because I became this paranoid shut-in who sees conspiracies everywhere. But she's alive. She has a future. You're asking me to gamble her safety on the hope that public exposure is enough to protect us all. I'm asking you to stop more families from losing what you lost, what we all lost. Highland Residences is done. The victims are dead. Nothing changes that. But Hartwell is building 8 new residential complexes right now with the same cheap materials and the same falsified reports. 60 families are going to move into those buildings believing they're safe. How many of them die if we do nothing? The math was brutal and unanswerable, the kind of moral calculus that had no good solutions, only less terrible ones. Walter stood and walked to the window again, pressing his forehead against the glass like he was trying to push through it into some alternate reality where none of this had happened, where he'd said no 4 years ago and lost his job instead of his soul. If I do this, if I agree to testify, I want protection for my daughter. Real protection, not federal theater. Can you guarantee that Jo glanced at Declan, something passing between them that felt like shared understanding that they were promising things they had no authority to promise, making guarantees they couldn't keep because the alternative was giving up, and neither of them knew how to do that anymore? We'll make sure she's safe. How, I don't know yet, but we will. Walter turned from the window, and for the first time since they'd arrived, something like resolve appeared in his face, fragile and uncertain but present. Okay, I'll testify, but if anything happens to my daughter, if she gets so much as a threatening phone call, I'm done. Understood? Understood. They left Walter's house 20 minutes later with a signed affidavit and a recording of him explaining exactly how Preston Hartwell had coerced him into falsifying reports, exactly what threats had been made and what payments had been offered, exactly how the entire scheme worked from initial bribe to final cover-up. It was enough to destroy a corporation and end a career and potentially send a billionaire to prison for the rest of his life. Declan drove back toward town in silence, his hands trembling on the wheel, Jo beside him reviewing the recording to make sure every word was clear and documented. They were 10 miles from Walter's house when Declan's phone rang, Owen's name lighting up the dashboard screen. Don't answer it. I have to. He's covering for me at work, telling people I'm out sick. Declan hit accept, and Owen's voice filled the truck, loud and agitated in a way that immediately triggered alarm bells. Where are you right now? driving home. Why? Because Walter Brennan just called 911 reporting a break-in at his house. Said 2 people showed up claiming to be journalists asking about Highland residences. Said he felt threatened and wants them arrested for trespassing. Declan's foot hit the brake instinctively, the truck jerking to a stop on the shoulder while his brain tried to process betrayal that made no sense given what had just happened, given the affidavit and the recording and the agreement they'd all made 30 minutes ago. Joe grabbed his arm. Drive, now. Walter just gave himself insurance in case Hartwell finds out we were there. Drive before someone actually calls the police. Declan accelerated back onto the road, his heart hammering against his ribs, while Owen continued talking through the speakers, oblivious to the fact that his warning had come too late. Rivers, what the hell are you involved in? Breaking into people's houses, harassing witnesses? We didn't break in. He let us in. We talked, that's all. Then why is he saying you threatened him? Because he's terrified of the person we're investigating, and this is his insurance policy. Owen, I need you to trust me. I'm doing the right thing, but it's complicated and I can't explain over the phone. A long pause filled with breathing, and what sounded like Owen pacing his footsteps echoing through whatever room he was calling from. Does this have anything to do with Caroline everything? Another pause, longer this time, and when Owen spoke again, his voice carried a weight Declan had never heard before. The sound of someone realizing their friend was walking into a fire and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Be careful. And Rivers, don't let that journalist get you killed. Ruby needs you alive more than she needs you righteous. The call ended, and Declan drove the rest of the way home in silence, broken only by Jo's fingers moving across her tablet typing notes and organizing evidence and building the case that would either destroy Preston Hartwell or get them both killed trying. They reached Declan's duplex at 9:30 to find Ruby asleep on the couch, with the television playing cartoons at low volume, the babysitter they'd hired reading a magazine in the kitchen. Declan paid her $40 they couldn't afford and walked her to her car, watching until her taillights disappeared before going back inside to find Jo sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and an expression on her face that looked like she'd just discovered something that changed everything. We have a problem. Declan lifted Ruby from the couch without waking her, carried her upstairs to bed, tucked her in with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times while their brain was occupied elsewhere. When he came back down, Jo had her screen turned toward him, displaying what looked like a news article from 3 hours ago. Walter Brennan was found dead in his home 20 minutes after we left. Single gunshot wound to the head. Police are calling it suicide. The words hit like physical blows, each one landing in a different part of Declan's body until he couldn't tell which hurt more, the rage or the grief or the terrible understanding that they'd killed Walter Brennan by asking him to be brave when survival required cowardice. We did this. Jo's face was stone, no emotion visible, but her hands shook slightly when she closed the laptop. Preston did this. We gave Walter a choice and he made it, and Preston made sure there would be consequences. This isn't our fault. He had a daughter. She's 23, lives in Portland. What do we tell her? Nothing. We can't contact her, can't acknowledge we were ever there. The police will investigate. They'll find our fingerprints all over Walter's house. They'll figure out we were the last people to see him alive. We need to get ahead of this before we become suspects in a murder disguised as suicide. Declan's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. 5 words that made his blood run cold. I know what you're doing. No signature, no context, but the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Someone was watching. Someone knew they'd been to Walter's house. Someone wanted them to understand that whatever protection they thought they had was an illusion. Jo saw his face and grabbed the phone, reading the message with eyes that went hard and calculating. That's Preston or someone working for him. They're trying to scare us into stopping. It's working. Good. Fear means you're smart enough to understand the stakes. But stopping means Walter died for nothing. Means the next 14 people who get crushed in a Hartwell building die for nothing too. Is that what you want? The question was rhetorical, but Declan answered it anyway, his voice coming out damaged like his throat had been lined with broken glass. No. Then we finish this. Tomorrow we go to the FBI with everything we have. The emails, the accounting records, the recording we made tonight, Walter's affidavit from before he died. We bury Preston so deep he never sees daylight again. Declan looked at his kitchen, at the cracked linoleum and the cheap appliances and the bills piled on the counter that he couldn't pay, looked at the ceiling above which his daughter slept, believing her father could protect her from monsters that turned out to be real and wealthy and untouchable by anything except exposure. What if it's not enough? What if we hand the FBI everything and they decide Preston's too connected to prosecute? Then we publish anyway. I still have contacts at independent outlets who don't take Hartwell money. We make this so public that ignoring it becomes impossible. Either the law handles it or public pressure does, but one way or another, Preston Hartwell answers for what he's done. His supervisor called the next morning while Declan was making Ruby breakfast. The conversation lasted 4 minutes, was professionally courteous, and destroyed Declan's income in the time it took to explain that he should clean out his desk and surrender his credentials by end of business today. Administrative leave pending investigation into allegations of misconduct, specifically using his position as a city inspector to harass private citizens and interfere with active construction projects. Jo found him sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing, his phone face down where he'd thrown it after the call ended. She didn't ask what happened, probably could read it on his face, just maneuvered close enough that their knees touched and waited for him to be ready to talk. I'm suspended. No income, no health insurance, no job to go back to once this is over, assuming there is an after where going back is possible. Preston's trying to isolate you. Cut off your resources so you can't fight back. It's a standard playbook when you're targeting someone with limited means. Make them desperate, make them choose between righteousness and survival. Well, it's working. I have maybe 6 weeks of savings if I stop paying everything except rent and utilities. After that, Ruby and I are homeless. Jo pulled out her phone, typed something, then showed him the screen displaying a bank transfer confirmation for $10,000 into his account from a source listed as freelance journalism payment. I can't take your money. It's not charity. Consider it an advance on the book deal you're going to get when this is over. Your story as the engineer who brought down a corrupt construction empire publishers will fight over that. What if we lose? Then you pay me back by raising Ruby to be the kind of person who fights anyway, even when losing is guaranteed. That's worth more than money. The words settled over Declan like a blanket, warm and suffocating at the same time, because accepting help meant admitting he couldn't do this alone, meant trusting someone he'd known for less than a week. With his daughter's future, meant opening himself up to caring about another person when caring had proven to be the most reliable path to devastation. But the alternative was giving up, was letting Preston win, was teaching Ruby that the right thing didn't matter if it cost too much, and that lesson would poison her more thoroughly than poverty or danger or any of the consequences that came from fighting battles you couldn't win. Okay, thank you. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the FBI meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning, rehearsing what to say and how to present evidence in ways that made prosecution inevitable instead of optional. Jo had contacts in the bureau, people she'd worked with on previous investigations, who understood that corporate crime was still crime, even when it wore expensive suits and donated to charity. Ruby stayed home from school claiming a stomachache that was probably anxiety disguised as illness, and Declan let her, because the truth was he didn't want her out of his sight when anonymous texts were arriving and witnesses were dying within hours of agreeing to testify. Around 3 in the afternoon, Jo's phone rang with a number she clearly recognized because her entire body went rigid before she answered. The conversation lasted 2 minutes, consisted mostly of her listening with a face that progressively darkened until she looked like violence was the only reasonable response to whatever she was hearing. When she hung up, her voice came out flat and mechanical. That was my former editor. Preston Hartwell just bought the newspaper. Paid cash, took ownership this morning. First order of business was firing everyone who'd worked on investigative journalism in the last 5 years, including my editor. He's systematically eliminating every platform I could use to publish this story. Declan felt something inside him snap the last thread of belief that playing by the rules would produce justice. Preston wasn't just rich and connected, he was willing to spend whatever it took to bury the truth, was moving with the speed and precision of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly which levers to pull to make problems disappear. Then we bypass traditional media. We post everything online, social media, independent blogs, anywhere that can't be bought or controlled, and hope it goes viral before Preston's lawyers bury us in defamation suits. That's not a strategy, Declan. That's desperation. You have a better idea. Jo didn't answer immediately, her fingers drumming against the armrest of her chair in a rhythm that suggested her brain was working through scenarios and calculating odds. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone making a decision they knew was probably wrong, but couldn't avoid. We go to the FBI tomorrow as planned. We hand them everything, and we demand action. If they refuse, if they're too scared or too compromised to prosecute, then we burn it all down publicly and accept whatever consequences come. But we try the legal route first, because if we don't, we're just vigilantes with evidence instead of citizens seeking justice. The distinction felt academic, given that Preston had already demonstrated his willingness to kill and bribe and manipulate every system designed to hold him accountable. But Jo was right that trying mattered, that exhausting legitimate options before resorting to illegitimate ones was the difference between revolution and chaos. Ruby appeared in the doorway, still in pajamas, at 3 in the afternoon, holding her stuffed dinosaur with an expression that suggested she'd been listening longer than they realized. "Daddy, can I ask you something? Always. Are the bad people going to hurt us?" The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled, forcing Declan to choose between honesty and protection, between preparing his daughter for danger and preserving what remained of her innocence. He looked at Jo, who gave the slightest nod that meant she'd support whatever he decided, but this was his call to make. "I don't know, sweetheart. I'm doing everything I can to keep us safe. But sometimes when you fight bad people, they fight back. Do you understand?" Ruby's grip tightened on the dinosaur, her knuckles going white. "Mrs. Patterson says brave people aren't the ones who aren't scared. Brave people are the ones who are scared but do the right thing anyway. Are you being brave, Daddy?" Declan felt tears threatening and forced them back because crying in front of his daughter would confirm her fears instead of alleviating them. "I'm trying to be. Then I'm proud of you even if I'm scared." She said it with the kind of simple certainty that children possessed before the world taught them that pride and fear could coexist, but usually didn't win you anything except exhaustion. Then she climbed into Declan's lap, despite being too old for it, curled against his chest like she used to when she was 3 and the world was smaller, and Declan held her while Jo pretended to review documents and gave them privacy for grief that didn't have a name yet because nobody had died except Walter Brennan, and he'd been a stranger. Around midnight, Jo's hand found his across the scattered papers on the kitchen table. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know this wasn't a mistake. Working with you, fighting this fight, even if we lose it, mattered." Declan looked at this woman who'd crashed into his life disguised as a blind date and revealed herself to be something closer to destiny or disaster, who'd given him purpose when he'd spent 4 years drowning in its absence, who'd made him believe that one person could matter even when every system was designed to prove otherwise. "I love you." The words came out before he could stop them, raw and unfiltered, and Jo's eyes went wide with something that might have been surprise or recognition or fear that loving broken people only ever ended one way. "Declan, you don't have to say it back. I just needed you to know in case tomorrow goes wrong and I don't get another chance." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands still covering his, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. "I love you too. And Ruby. And this stupid, impossible fight we're in. But love doesn't protect us from what's coming. You know that, right?" "Yeah, I know." They kissed then, desperate and tender at the same time. And Declan understood that this was what it felt like to be alive again after years of practicing death, to open yourself to someone knowing they could be taken away, to choose vulnerability when safety was so much easier and so much lonelier. Jo left around 1, making him promise to lock every door and check every window and call her if anything felt wrong. Declan did all of it, then stood in Ruby's doorway watching her sleep, thinking about Caroline and Walter Brennan and all the people who'd died because Preston Hartwell valued profit over human life. Tomorrow they would hand the FBI enough evidence to bury a billionaire. Tomorrow they would find out if justice was real or just a story we told ourselves to make powerlessness feel like choice. Tomorrow everything would either get better or catastrophically worse, and there was no way to know which until the moment arrived. His phone buzzed one final time. Preston Hartwell's name appearing on screen at 1 in the morning, and when Declan answered, the voice that filled his ear was grandfatherly and warm, like they were old friends catching up. "Mr. Rivers, I hope I'm not calling too late." Every muscle in Declan's body locked fight-or-flight instincts screaming contradictory instructions, while his brain tried to process that the man who'd killed his wife was calling him at 1 in the morning like this was normal. "How did you get this number? I have resources." "But that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because I understand you've been asking questions about Highland residences, making accusations that could damage my company's reputation. I wanted to extend an invitation to discuss this face-to-face, clear up any misunderstandings before they become problems neither of us can walk back from." The faint electric hum of a wheelchair motor was audible in the background, a sound Declan recognized from their encounter years ago when Preston had offered the bribe before Highland fell, when the billionaire was already confined to his chair from an earlier construction accident he'd never learned from. "I'm not interested in talking, not even for $10 million. That's my final offer, Mr. Rivers. Enough to send Ruby to any college she wants, buy a house in a good neighborhood, live comfortably for the rest of your life. All you have to do is sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away from this vendetta that's consuming you." The word vendetta landed like a slap, reducing Carolyn's death to personal grievance instead of systematic murder, reframing justice as obsession that reasonable people would abandon for the right price. "My wife is dead because of your greed. Your wife is dead because of a tragic accident that I've spent 4 years trying to make right. The settlement I offered was generous, more than most families received. You refused it out of pride or grief or whatever emotion was driving you, and I respected that. But now you're working with a journalist who has her own agenda, breaking into my construction sites, harassing my employees, and I can't let that continue." Declan's throat closed around words that wanted to be shouted, but came out measured instead because losing control would give Preston exactly what he wanted. "You murdered Walter Brennan. Walter committed suicide. The police investigated thoroughly. Sometimes guilt becomes unbearable and people make terrible choices. I'm sorry he's gone, but his death has nothing to do with me or my company." The denial was perfect, practiced, probably rehearsed with lawyers who'd perfected the art of sounding truthful while lying through their teeth. Preston had done this before, had threatened and bribed and killed his way out of consequences so many times that it was reflex now, automatic as breathing. "I'm going to the FBI tomorrow with evidence that proves everything." "No, you're not. Because if you do, I'll make sure Ruby suffers in ways you can't imagine. Not physically, I'm not a monster, despite what your journalist friend has told you, but I can destroy her future as easily as I destroyed yours. Every school she applies to will reject her. Every job she seeks will evaporate. Every friend she makes will be warned that associating with the Rivers family brings consequences. I can make her a pariah, Mr. Rivers, and you can't stop me because money is gravity and I have enough of it to bend the world however I want." The threat was specific enough to be credible, delivered in a tone that suggested Preston viewed this as unfortunate necessity rather than cruelty. Declan looked toward the stairs where Ruby slept at the evidence they'd gathered at the case they'd built that could finally deliver justice, and felt the impossible choice crystallizing into something he couldn't avoid. "I need time to think. You have until tomorrow at 5 p.m. Come to my office alone and we'll discuss terms. Or don't, and watch everything you love turn to ash. Your choice." The line went dead, and Declan sat there holding his phone like it was a weapon that had just fired, and he couldn't quite process whether he'd been hit. He texted Jo immediately, his fingers shaking so badly it took 3 tries to type the message coherently. Preston just called. Threatened Ruby. Not physical, her future. Schools, jobs, friends. Said he'll destroy her life if I don't walk away. The response came back in seconds. "He's bluffing." "Is he?" "He killed Caroline and 14 others. He paralyzed you. He murdered Walter. What wouldn't he do?" 3 dots appeared and disappeared for a long time before Jo's reply finally came through. "Preston Hartwell is a coward who hides behind lawyers and money because he's too weak to face consequences directly. The second we hand this evidence to the FBI, his power evaporates because exposure is the one thing money can't fix. But only if we actually do it. And if he follows through on his threats, then we deal with it together. Ruby is 7 years old. She has decades to build a life to find her own path to become whoever she's meant to be. But she can't do any of that if you teach her that bullies win when you're scared enough. Is that the lesson you want her to learn? Declan stared at the words until they blurred, understanding that Jo was right, but also that being right didn't make Ruby safer, didn't guarantee anything except more conflict and more danger, and more chances for everything to fall apart. He was still staring when headlights swept across the front window. A vehicle parking outside, engine idling, and through the glass, Declan could see the unmistakable silhouette of federal agents emerging from unmarked sedans. The doorbell rang before he could process what was happening. Agent Claire Morrison stood on the porch with 3 other agents, her expression grim in a way that made Declan's stomach drop before she even spoke. "Mr. Rivers, we need to talk. We need to. Preston Hartwell just filed for emergency custody of Ruby, claiming you're engaging in criminal activity that makes you an unfit parent. He has a judge signing the order right now. You have maybe 20 minutes before Child Services shows up to take her." The world tilted sideways. Everything Declan thought he understood about reality dissolving into the sick comprehension that Preston had been 3 steps ahead the entire time, that the phone call wasn't negotiation, but setup, that while Declan was agonizing over choices, Preston was already moving to eliminate them. He can't do that. He can if he has evidence of you trespassing on construction sites, breaking into secure facilities, working with a known hacker. Agent Morrison glanced toward the street where Jo's van was pulling up, emergency flashers blinking. "Ms. Whitman's methods aren't exactly legal. Preston's lawyers have been building a case against you for weeks. They have photos, surveillance footage enough to paint you as a dangerous radical putting your daughter at risk." Ruby appeared at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Daddy, who's here?" Declan's throat closed completely. He looked at Agent Morrison, at Jo, climbing out of her van with urgency written across her face, at his daughter who was about to be taken away because he'd chosen righteousness over caution, because he'd believed that fighting mattered more than hiding. Jo reached the porch, took in the scene with one glance, and her voice cut through the paralysis. "We end this right now. Tonight. We don't wait for Preston's timeline. We don't play his game. We go to his office with every agent the FBI can spare. We wear wires. We get him on record threatening a child, and we destroy him before he can destroy us." Agent Morrison shook her head. "That's not how this works. We need warrants. We need authorization. You need a billionaire confessing to murder on tape. I can get you that. But we have to move now before Child Services arrives, before Preston realizes we're not paralyzed by his threats." Something shifted in Morrison's expression. Professional caution giving way to the kind of anger that came from watching powerful people escape justice one time too many. "If I do this, if I go off book, and it falls apart, my career is over. And if you don't, how many more people die in buildings Preston cuts corners on? How many more Walter Brennans get murdered for trying to do the right thing?" The question hung in the air for 3 seconds that felt like hours. Then Morrison pulled out her phone and started making calls, her voice carrying the clipped precision of someone who'd just decided that some rules were worth breaking. "Get Ruby dressed and ready to travel. You're all coming with us. If Preston wants to threaten a child, he can do it in front of federal witnesses." 30 minutes later, Declan sat in the back of an FBI sedan with Ruby beside him, asking questions he couldn't answer, and Jo in the vehicle behind them, coordinating with Morrison about what came next. They drove through empty streets toward Hartwell Tower, that 47-story monument to money and murder, and Declan felt time compressing into something that moved too fast and too slow simultaneously. Ruby's hand found his in the darkness. "Are we in trouble, Daddy?" "No, sweetheart. We're fixing trouble." The bad man who hurt Mommy Declan looked at his daughter at eyes that saw too much and understood more than he wanted her to, and made a choice that Caroline would have made, the choice to be honest when honesty was terrifying. "Yes. Tonight we're going to make sure he can't hurt anyone else ever again." Ruby nodded. processing this with the seriousness she brought to everything important, then squeezed his hand once and said nothing more. Her small fingers wrapped around his like an anchor to something worth protecting. Hartwell Tower loomed ahead, its upper floors lit like a beacon or a warning, impossible to tell which. The FBI vehicles pulled into the underground parking garage, agents emerging with coordinated efficiency. Morrison appeared at Declan's window with a wire that looked impossibly small to carry the weight of everything they needed it to record. "He's expecting you at 5 p.m. It's 4:58. You're going up there. You're going to let him make his threats, and you're going to get him talking about Highland residences, about Walter Brennan, about every crime he thinks he's gotten away with. Can you do that?" Declan's hands were shaking, but his voice came out steady. "Yes. And, Ms. Whitman, you're going too. He threatened her as much as he threatened you. 2 witnesses are better than 1. They rode the elevator to the 47th floor in silence, Declan's heart hammering against the wire taped to his chest, while Joe's crutches clicked against marble in rhythms that might have been nervousness or might have been determination. The doors opened directly into Preston's office, and there he was, silver-haired and smiling like a grandfather waiting to dispense wisdom, his wheelchair positioned behind the massive mahogany desk with practiced precision. But Ruby was there too. She sat on the leather couch, exactly where someone had positioned her coloring in a Disney princess book, with crayons that looked expensive humming softly while she worked, completely unaware that her presence was leverage in a negotiation about her father's soul. Declan's vision went white with rage, so pure it felt like his blood had been replaced with gasoline and someone had struck a match. "What is she doing here?" Preston's smile never wavered, and the wheelchair motor hummed softly as he adjusted his position. "Insurance. I needed you to understand that I'm serious about the consequences of not cooperating. Ruby is perfectly safe, Mr. Rivers. She's been here for an hour, had cookies, watched cartoons, completely unaware that her presence is part of a negotiation. But she could become aware very quickly if you make this difficult." The gun on Preston's desk gleamed under recessed lighting, a Beretta that might have been loaded or might have been theater, impossible to tell from 10 feet away, but terrifying regardless, because even empty guns killed when wielded with conviction. Declan felt the wire against his chest like a brand, like proof that this moment was being recorded, that every word Preston spoke was evidence accumulating toward the destruction he'd spent decades avoiding. Jo moved forward on her crutches, her voice carrying contempt sharp enough to cut. "You brought a 7-year-old child into this. You're more of a monster than I thought. I'm practical, Ms. Whitman. 14 people died in Highland residences because I made calculated decisions about cost versus risk. Was I wrong? Obviously. Do I regret it more than you know? But I can't change the past. I can only manage the present and protect my future." He gestured to the briefcase on his desk, opening it to reveal money stacked with precision that suggested someone had counted it multiple times. $10 million, Mr. Rivers. Take it. Sign the NDA. Go home and raise your daughter in comfort instead of poverty. That's the smart play, the rational choice any father would make. Declan looked at Ruby, coloring obliviously at the gun at Preston Hartwell, offering blood money with one hand while threatening everything with the other. The wire recorded every word, every breath, evidence mounting like pressure in a sealed container. "And if I refuse, then Child Services takes Ruby tonight. My lawyers have already filed the paperwork. You'll spend years fighting for custody while she grows up in foster care, learning that her father valued revenge over her well-being. Is that what you want?" The threat was specific, credible, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd weaponized the legal system so many times it was reflex. But underneath Preston's certainty, Declan heard something else, something that sounded like desperation disguised as control, like a man who knew the walls were closing in and was making increasingly reckless moves to keep them at bay. "You killed my wife. You murdered Walter Brennan. You tried to kill Joe. And you think money erases that?" Preston's mask slipped for just a second, revealing the fear underneath, and the wheelchair rolled back slightly as if he was trying to create distance. "I never killed anyone. I made business decisions that had unfortunate outcomes. There's a legal distinction. There's no distinction between pulling a trigger and cutting corners that collapse buildings. You murdered 14 people as surely as if you'd put guns to their heads. And now you're threatening to destroy my daughter's life because I won't let you get away with it. Mr. Rivers, you're forcing my hand. I don't want to hurt Ruby. I don't want to hurt anyone. But I will protect what I've built. And if that means Ruby's voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk, small and confused and devastating. Daddy, why is the nice man being mean? Everyone froze. Ruby had stopped coloring and was looking at Preston with the unfiltered perception of a child who just realized that cookies and cartoons were camouflage for something darker. Preston's face went through calculations visible in real time, weighing whether maintaining the facade mattered when the recording was already happening. I'm not being mean, sweetheart. Your father and I are just having a grown-up conversation about how you killed my mommy. The words landed like bombs in the silence. Preston's composure shattered completely, his hand moving toward the gun with instinct that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with cornered animal desperation, and Declan lunged forward, his body moving before his brain could process the decision. Preston's fingers closed around the Beretta just as FBI agents burst through the door with weapons drawn and voices shouting commands that turned the penthouse into chaos. Drop the weapon. Hands where we can see them. Now. Preston froze the gun halfway, raised his face, registering shock that something had gone wrong with his carefully planned intimidation. The wheelchair motor whined as he tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go, agents surrounding him with the precision of people who'd done this before. Morrison stepped forward, her weapon trained on Preston's center mass. Preston Hartwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. Witness tampering, terroristic threats against a minor, and about 40 other charges we'll add once we review this recording. Put the gun down slowly and step away from the desk. The Beretta clattered to the mahogany surface and Preston's hands went up, shaking in a way that suggested the reality of consequences was finally penetrating decades of insulation from them. An agent moved forward to secure the weapon, while another produced handcuffs, and Preston's voice came out thin and desperate, nothing like the grandfatherly warmth from 5 minutes ago. You don't understand. I can't. I'm disabled. Prison isn't designed for. Declan ran to Ruby, scooping her up while she protested that she wasn't finished coloring yet, completely unaware that her presence in this office had been leveraged as a threat against her father's life. Jo reached them and wrapped her arms around both of them, and Declan felt something inside him crack open. 4 years of grief and rage and desperate hope, all releasing simultaneously in a way that left him shaking with tears. He didn't remember starting to cry. Morrison approached after Preston was cuffed and being read his rights, his wheelchair surrounded by agents who looked like they'd been waiting years for this moment. We got everything. Every threat, every admission. Enough to put him away for the rest of his life. And Mr. Rivers, the custody filing was fake. Preston's lawyers submitted it, but it was never processed. He was bluffing the whole time. The words should have brought relief, but all Declan felt was exhaustion, the kind that came from running on adrenaline so long that stopping felt like dying. Ruby pulled back from the embrace, enough to look at his face, her young eyes searching for understanding. Did we win? Daddy. Declan looked at Jo, who was watching him with an expression that held everything they'd survived together, all the fear and fighting and love that had emerged from tragedy when they'd been brave enough to let it. He looked at Morrison, who nodded once with satisfaction that justice wasn't perfect, but sometimes it was possible. He looked at Preston being wheeled toward the elevator in handcuffs, the man's face twisted into something that looked like he was finally understanding what it meant to be powerless. Yes, sweetheart, we won. But Preston wasn't done. As the agents moved him toward the elevator, his voice rose, cracking with emotion that might have been genuine or might have been one final manipulation. Wait, please, Mr. Rivers, Declan, please. You don't understand what prison means for someone in my condition. The facilities aren't equipped. The other inmates... Please, I'm begging you. The wheelchair stopped and Preston turned as much as the cuffs would allow, tears streaming down his face in a way that looked practiced but also desperate. You have a daughter. You understand what it's like to be helpless, to need protection. I'll cooperate. I'll give you everything. Names, accounts, every project where corners were cut. $20 million, $50 million, whatever you want. Just tell them I helped. Tell them I deserve consideration. Please don't let them take me." The begging continued as agents tried to wheel him away, Preston's voice rising to something close to a shriek. "I'm sorry. About Caroline, about Walter, about all of it. I'll make it right. I'll fund scholarships in her name. I'll pay for Ruby's entire education. Please, Declan, please." Declan watched this billionaire reduced to sobbing pleas, this man who'd built an empire on cut corners and dead bodies, now discovering that power was an illusion that dissolved the moment someone finally called the bluff. He thought about Caroline spending 4 minutes dying while Preston counted his profits. He thought about Walter Brennan's skinned dog and 15 years of terror. He thought about Jo learning to walk with crutches because Preston wanted to silence inconvenient questions. "You had 4 years to beg for mercy. My wife had 4 minutes while your greed crushed the life out of her." Preston's face crumpled, and the begging dissolved into incoherent sobbing as the elevator doors closed, cutting off the sound, but not the image of a man who'd spent decades untouchable, finally learning what accountability felt like. 8 months later, the trial ended with guilty verdicts on every count. The courtroom was packed with families who'd lost people in Highland residences and buildings like it, with journalists covering the downfall of a billionaire who'd thought money made him untouchable, with lawyers who'd learned that sometimes evidence was overwhelming enough to overcome even the best-paid defense. Preston Hartwell was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. His company dissolved within weeks, assets seized and liquidated to fund victim compensation. The judge's final words before sentencing became national news, quoted in every major outlet as evidence that the system could occasionally work. "Mr. Hartwell, you built an empire on the graves of people who trusted that American buildings don't fall down. You exploited that trust for profit, and when confronted with your crimes, you threatened a 7-year-old child. This court finds that no amount of money can purchase immunity from the consequences of 14 counts of negligent homicide." 3 months after the sentencing, Caroline's law passed with bipartisan support, mandating third-party inspections on all residential construction, establishing criminal liability for executives who ordered safety violations, protecting whistleblowers who reported corruption. Walter Brennan's daughter testified at the signing ceremony. Her father's courage finally recognized, even though he hadn't lived to see it vindicated. 1 year after Preston's arrest, Declan and Jo stood at Caroline's grave with flowers that Ruby had picked herself, bright colors against gray marble. The day was clear and cold, the kind of weather that made everything feel sharper, more real. Ruby placed the flowers carefully, then stepped back to stand between her father and the woman who'd become her second mother in all the ways that mattered. "Mommy, we got the bad man, and Daddy says you'd be proud." Declan's throat tightened, but he managed to speak, his voice steady despite everything it carried. "We did it, Caroline. Not just for you, but for everyone. The buildings are safe now. The law has your name on it, and I'm finally living instead of just surviving." Jo's hand found his, their fingers interlacing with the automatic comfort of people who'd fought through hell together and emerged whole on the other side. Ruby looked up at them both, her face serious. "Mrs. Patterson says families are built from love, not just blood. Is that true?" Declan knelt down to her level, his hands on her shoulders. "Yes, sweetheart. That's exactly true. Then we're a real family, you and me and Mom Jo." Jo leaned forward on her crutches, her voice thick with emotion she didn't try to hide. "The realest family I've ever had." Ruby smiled genuinely, the kind of smile that held no shadows or doubts, just the simple certainty of a child who knew she was loved and safe. She threw her arms around both of them, creating a tangle of limbs and crutches and hearts that had been broken but were learning to beat in rhythm again. They stayed at the grave for another few minutes, then walked back to their car, the one they'd bought with money from Declan's book deal about the fight to bring down a corrupt empire. The drive home took them past the empty lot where Riverside Towers had stood before inspectors condemned it. The space waited for developers who'd build to the new standards Caroline's law required. Ruby fell asleep in the back seat, her head resting against the window, and when they pulled into the driveway of their house, modest but theirs with ramps installed and a backyard where Ruby could play. Jo turned to Declan with a question that had been building for months. "Do you ever regret it? Fighting Preston instead of taking the money and running?" Declan thought about Caroline crushed under concrete, about Walter Brennan's courage and death, about his daughter asking if they were a real family while standing at her mother's grave. He thought about the buildings that wouldn't fall now, about the families who'd never know that their safety came from one broken man and one woman who refused to let injustice win, not even once. Jo kissed him, then gentle and certain, and somewhere in the distance thunder rumbled with the promise of rain. Ruby stirred but didn't wake, and Declan sat there with his daughter and the woman he loved, understanding that this was what winning looked like, not perfect, not painless, but real and earned, and worth every terrifying step it had taken to get here. The first drops hit the windshield as they carried Ruby inside together, and by the time they'd tucked her into bed, the rain was falling steady and sure, washing streets clean, drumming on the roof with rhythms that sounded like the world. Acknowledging that something had shifted, that power wasn't absolute and accountability was possible, and 14 people hadn't died for nothing. Declan stood in the kitchen doorway watching Jo make tea. This woman who'd crashed into his life and given him back reasons to fight, to hope, to believe that broken things could heal if you gave them time and courage and someone worth healing for. She looked up and smiled, and in that moment Declan understood that Caroline would have loved her, would have been proud of what they'd built from the ashes of tragedy. The tea was warm when they sat together at the table, listening to rain and Ruby's soft breathing from upstairs and the quiet hum of a house at peace. Tomorrow there would be interviews and meetings and 1,000 small decisions that made up the architecture of normal life. But tonight, there was just this: a sleeping child, a patient partner, a home that felt safe, and the certain knowledge that they'd done something that mattered. Somewhere above them, Ruby dreamed of princesses and dragons and fathers who slayed monsters, not with swords but with truth, which turned out to be the most powerful weapon anyone ever wielded.